Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, and welcome to this interview. Welcome to another interview for the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. I'm very pleased to be joined by a friend and colleague, Andy Worthington, who is in the United Kingdom. And he's a longtime journalist. You might know of his work. At least I hope you know of his work. He's been on the show before, but he's done tremendous work covering the Guantanamo Bay military prison for, I don't know, more than 15 years now. Welcome back.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, it's 18 and a half years that I've been pretty much working full time on Guantanamo. So not quite as long as the men still held there, some of whom, there are guys in Guantanamo who are on the very first planes in. But yes, a very, very long time. And as we can tell, with another president on the way, an extraordinarily difficult place to close, apparently.
It's actually worthless to just appeal to them based on their supposed fiscal conservatism as well, because they don't even care how much money is being sapped, because it's apparently worth the cost to continue to keep these men. So before we get too far into the specific topics I wanted to have you discuss today, could you just give people a brief outline of the state of Guantanamo? Not really Biden's legacy yet. We'll get to that, but how many men are still confined there, and then is there anything we should know about the camps? Is it all operational, or have all these men been moved to like certain camps just to like consolidate the population?
Sure, Kevin. Well, I mean, just to follow up on what we were talking about, the cost. It costs $500 million a year to keep Guantanamo and the military commission's trial system going. And there are 30 men held there. So the amount per person that it costs to keep them there is astronomical. I mean, beyond any amount that has ever been spent to deprive people of their liberty in human history. But as you say, certainly when it comes to military expenditure in the United States, we never, ever get lawmakers who are interested at all in suggesting that maybe what America spends is bloated beyond belief. Anyone who looks at the annual National Defense Authorization Act can realize that, when it comes to war, there's no stopping the amount of money that the United States government will spend. So there are 30 men held at Guantanamo Bay, and they are in two groups, essentially. There are the men who have never been charged with a crime, who are held in what I presume is still called the general population at Guantanamo. And there are at present, I think there are 16 people in this category of men who are in the general population and who have all been approved for release from Guantanamo, which I know we'll get round to. The other 14 men, 11 of them are or have been part of the military commission trial system, which operates at Guantanamo. And there are 3 men who have never been charged, but have never been approved for release either, who are also held with this group of men. So that's 14 of them in total. They were held in a special facility called Camp 7, which was an extremely secretive facility, but which was collapsing due to the inadequacy of its structure. And they've been moved to one of the older blocks, Camp 5, which is essentially isolation cells. And the other men, the men approved for release, are held in Camp 6, which is a prison where they are allowed to mingle with each other. But those are the two essential parts of Guantanamo that still exist. So Camp 7 was shut down. The other camps 1 to 4, and no longer exist. And Camp X-Ray, which was, the initial kind of animal cages that were built at Guantanamo, is long gone as well.
In the past week, I'll give people a date. On the 6th of November, there was a new development related to these 9/11 plea deals, which is quite a story. And it hasn't really received, I think, the kind of attention it deserves, but that's pretty standard for Guantanamo Bay when you think of the press. And even some of the more establishment reporters, they've had to pretty much fight to maintain this news beat, to continue to do this coverage. I'm thinking of someone like Carol Rosenberg at the New York Times, who I'm glad is still there to chronicle all of this. But it seems like as something that you would regularly cover, we don't get it, even when it is a major story like this, where you have the Pentagon chief, Lloyd Austin, essentially saying that he is not going to honor plea deals that were established. So why don't you get into this for people who are watching the show and describe the plea deals, and then this extraordinary development where the Pentagon is basically trying to sink these deals that, and in order for it to be a plea deal, my understanding, I'm not a lawyer, but if it's a plea deal, there were prosecutors, and then there were defense attorneys along with the accused who said, all right, we accept this. So you're having someone who's not even part of that process trying to kill this off.
Yeah. Well, I mean, very briefly, the plea deals involve 3 of the 5 men who are accused of involvement in the 9/11 attacks. So, the biggest story of all the stories connected to the war on terror, the foundational basis of all of that. And these men were seized in 2002 and 2003, and they were held and tortured for many years in the CIA black sites, which the United States, to its eternal shame, obliged other countries around the world whose arms could be twisted to host for them, because they couldn't actually host a torture prison on their own soil. So they did it in a variety of countries in Eastern Europe and around the world. They were held there for 3 to 4 years before they ended up at Guantanamo. That was in September 2006. And since then, there have been efforts to put them on trial. The military commissions were put on hold by Obama when he took office, and then were revived, and I think very unwisely revived, in tandem with what they wanted to do, which was to put some of these men on trial in federal court. And actually, the 9/11 co-accused were supposed to be put on trial in New York. And then the Obama administration dropped that because of a huge pushback from Republicans, but some Democrats as well. I think that, we can't have terrorists on our soil, we won't be safe. So ever since then, there have been attempts to prosecute them at Guantanamo. And this really is a kind of Groundhog Day for justice, where it just goes round and round, and we never actually get to the trials. What's happening this week is that the 53rd pre-trial hearings in the 9/11 case are happening at Guantanamo. The 53rd. And the basic premise of the problem here, Kevin, is that these are men who were tortured for years by the United States government. And the use of torture is fundamentally incompatible with the exercise of justice. It's that simple, really. What's happened for years, because of all these pre-trial hearings, is that one side, the defense teams, have been trying to get the government to provide them with all the information they need to be able to provide an adequate defense for their clients, with persistent problems in non-compliance on the part of the government and providing them with everything that they need. The government's job, on the other hand, has been to try to consistently hide the evidence of the use of torture, because that will very fundamentally complicate matters, as well as certainly from the point of view of the CIA, possibly implicating personnel who were directly involved in the torture. So, this went on for years and years and years. And what happened 3 years ago is that one of the men who was held in the CIA black site, Majid Khan, who was at the time of his capture was a young American resident, Pakistani national, who at a very low point in his life had been prevailed upon by relatives in Pakistan when he visited to become involved in Al-Qaeda. He was very distraught at the time through the loss of his mother. And he was recruited by them essentially as a courier. Now, when he was seized, he was immediately filled with remorse at what he had done and was cooperative with the United States operatives who seized him and held him. But they tortured him nevertheless for 3.5 years until he arrived at Guantanamo. They treated him pretty appallingly at Guantanamo as well. And then eventually in 2012, he agreed to a plea deal in which he would get a reduced sentence in exchange for helping with evidence in the cases of some of the other men facing prosecutions at Guantanamo. It took 10 years for the sentencing to come about following this plea deal. That was already designed at the time. But when he finally came to be sentenced, he was allowed to deliver a statement openly describing, his position, his remorse, but also describing in excruciating detail everything that had happened to him. And as a result of this, the military jury that was presiding in his case was so appalled that 7 of the 8 members of the military jury wrote a handwritten letter to the judge calling for clemency and stating how appalling they found this information, that it betrayed the very fundamental ideals and that the United States was supposed to believe in. This, I think, was what particularly convinced the prosecutors that they were on a hiding to nowhere, trying to pursue the prosecutions at Guantanamo, which was when they started working with the defense teams on the 9/11 case. And with the convening authority, who is the military official assigned by the government to oversee the military commissions at Guantanamo, to work on plea deals, which would resolve this endless inability to reach any kind of conclusion. I must, note that the 9/11 case is additionally complicated by the fact that the United States has been seeking the death penalty. And by law, death penalty cases require, many more layers of requirements of probity than other kinds of cases. They're administratively much more difficult. The plea deals, which have been arranged, over 2.5 years nearly, would take the death penalty off the table, and they would not free the men. I mean, the men would stay at Guantanamo forever. But they would not be executed, and there would also quite essentially, I think, be some kind of closure, because these men would have to admit what it is that they did, to get a plea deal rather than to have the trial, which wasn't going to work, go ahead in the first place. So really, it's the only solution to the intractable problem of what happens when you try to prosecute via the law men who have been horribly tortured for years. And this is what, at the end of July, this suddenly was announced that the convening authority at Guantanamo had, a high-ranking former military official had agreed to the plea deals. And that they were going to go ahead. And that was the point at which Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, suddenly decided that that wasn't acceptable and overruled her, which immediately led to quite prominently voiced dissent that this was actually an abuse of the chain of command, because he had delegated these responsibilities to Susan Escalier, who was the convening authority, and that he had no right afterwards to decide that he was going to de-delegate her because he didn't like the decision that she had taken. And what happened last week is that the military judge in the case has agreed that he overstepped the mark and that he had no right to withdraw the plea deals. So the plea deals are now back on the table. I know that Lloyd Austin has said that he fundamentally disagrees with the judge's ruling, but the administration hasn't said that they're going to appeal it. And I would very much hope that they don't. What I think's telling about this in particular, Kevin, is why they did it. And why they did it demonstrates, I think, very clearly two things. One is that the Democratic government of Joe Biden was absolutely committed ideologically to the notion that these men must be punished, and that would involve the death sentence. That a plea deal is seen somehow as soft and inappropriate. And, and this is ridiculous because it fails to recognize that successful prosecutions cannot go ahead because of the torture to which these men were subjected. I just think that's crucial. And I think that they didn't want to recognize that amongst themselves. The second part of the story is that they didn't want to allow this to proceed because, of course, it would have led to an avalanche of Republican criticism, because the Republicans also don't want anything to interfere with their notion that it is entirely right and appropriate to execute these men, and their complete unwillingness to understand that torturing them meant that was impossible. I am pretty sure that there are people within the parties. I would say there are more Republicans, but maybe some within the Democrats who just wish that they could summarily execute these men because they know that they're the bad guys and that they're guilty and that they did it, and they're fed up of how tangled up in red tape everything has become. But I think that's the bottom line about it. Is this is the only way forward? And surely it's crucial for the survivors and the family members of the victims of 9/11 that this would finally provide them with closure. They would get to know what happened, as told and confirmed by these men who are never going to be free again, and that all that's happened is that we've taken execution off the table. I think, as someone from a country that long got rid of the death penalty, it shows what a kind of execution fixation there is in so many parts of the United States.
I would say that this exemplifies the kind of resentment that must be a part of everyday life in Guantanamo and among the government to allowing these men to have the same sorts of due process that we take for granted under the so-called rule of law. And my bet is that if you talk to any Democrat or Republican, they might be pretty sick and tired of the defense attorneys down there who have worked fairly tirelessly. I know actually they're probably pretty tired. They've cycled through, there have been defense lawyers that have come and gone because of how much work it takes to toil and trouble your way. As you say, it's like the Groundhog Day of justice and in America, because you go there and then it doesn't proceed in any direction. But you also have things like the CIA is spying on defense attorneys, and that horribly compromises proceedings. So everything is brought to a screeching halt, and then they have to deal with the fallout. And so I just think that this is the natural culmination of this. In your mind, would you agree that either it would end in plea deals like what we're seeing, or the men would just die in prison? And then that doesn't serve anybody who is a member of what they collectively call the 9/11 families. I mean, that doesn't allow them, as you were saying earlier, any closure. They don't get to hear from these men who the government has said are responsible for what happened to the attack that happened in New York?
Yeah, most crucially, I think it's for the victims and the families of those who died, Kevin. That it's the only way of providing closure. I mean, if we look at the CIA's point of view, I'm sure their best scenario is that the men rot at Guantanamo, nothing ever proceeds to trial, because then nothing will ever be revealed publicly in any way about what they actually got up to in their in the 4.5 years that they were operating the most scandalously vile torture prisons around the world. So much of the efforts of the government have been to shield the CIA from accountability for the monstrous behavior that it undertook for 4.5 years. I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, another component of this that's important but doesn't really get discussed is the situation in which everybody who's held at Guantanamo is held. They are not treated adequately for physical ailments and mental health ailments as a result, not just of 2 decades at Guantanamo, but for those who were in the black sites before, for the impact that had on their mental health and on them physically. And most people don't know about this because so little is ever spoken about Guantanamo. But Guantanamo persists in being a place where it is impossible to get adequate physical or mental health treatment because those facilities simply don't exist there, and they have never been implemented there. If you get really physically ill at Guantanamo, and there is a case of a poor man there who's now had, I think, 7 operations on a degenerative spinal condition, which threatens to leave him completely paralyzed. They don't have the facilities to do that adequately at Guantanamo, which is why he's ended up having 7 botched operations. You are literally prevented by US law from being taken to the US mainland to an adequate facility if you are a prisoner at Guantanamo. By US law, you are prevented from setting foot on US soil for any reason. This was a ban that Republicans imposed under Obama, and they renew it every year in the National Defense Authorization Act. So another thing that would come with the plea deal was that if you're going to keep these men at Guantanamo forever, then you essentially provide them with end-of-life care for as long as they live, with adequate mental health and physical care facilities, which at present don't exist and have never existed for any of the men held there. Even, the insignificant prisoners in vast numbers who, never really did anything and have, all been freed over the years. It's one of the scandals of Guantanamo, and it was actually exposed last year by a UN special rapporteur who visited the prison for the first time. This wasn't because UN rapporteurs hadn't wanted to visit. It was because until that point, the US government would never guarantee that they would be able to talk with the prisoners without being spied upon. The Biden administration congratulated itself on allowing a UN rapporteur to visit, and they thought they'd get a fairly clean rap sheet when it came to conditions at Guantanamo. But Fionnuala, the UN rapporteur, actually concluded that the totality of factors at Guantanamo, not just the broken legal processes, but the persistent dehumanization of the men held there, and the persistent refusal to the persistent isolation, essentially, and the refusal to allow them really much of a meaningful contact with their families at all. The totality of factors, she concluded, meant that Guantanamo, as it is now, as it was when it opened, fundamentally, is a place where inhumane treatment is part of the entire system, constitutes inhumane treatment, and may, in cases, rise to the level of torture. The Biden administration was shocked. The media noticed for about 10 minutes, and then everybody moved on. But this is the fundamental truth about Guantanamo today, and it's only, I think, really going to be highlighted through this plea deal and through the conditions that the men are demanding in exchange for, which are baseline conditions that everyone should be entitled to have when they're deprived of their liberty, but that they're demanding in exchange for the plea deal.
And one of the men who is part of the plea deals is Amar Baluchi. Could you tell people about who he is? And I have spent the last few days looking at his story and how right now one of his attorneys through the ACLU is fighting the CIA because um, in a very farcical manner they continue to claim that they've never confirmed that there's operational control that the CIA had over Camp 7, and so they're depriving him of these materials, which I suppose at this stage, if he's going to get a plea deal, he probably doesn't need it as much as he did when he filed this request for records back in 2017. But that said, we're getting at something crucial, which is the secrecy around Guantanamo that just is laughable on its face because we know so much information about it. And the people who run Guantanamo don't really hide it, or the military people who you would think would respect this secrecy, they don't actually always do so in these proceedings anyways.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is absurd on every level. Kafkaesque only begins to touch upon the brutal realities of it all. Amar actually isn't part of the plea deal. He's not one of the three men who
Oh, I
agreed to the
misread that
deal.
then. Okay.
So his lawyers are still pursuing some other avenue, which I don't know what that is at the moment. I
Okay.
should mention as well that the fifth man, who's part of the co-accused or was initially, Ramzi bin al-Shibh, is now floating in a complete limbo at Guantanamo because a Department of Defense Sanity Board concluded that he was unfit to stand trial because of the mental health conditions that he faces as a result of his torture and of his time at Guantanamo. So he, I don't even know what status he has at Guantanamo now. That presumably will at some point have to be resolved, but it hasn't been yet. And yeah, the thing with Amar, who's a nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's the alleged mastermind of the 9/11 attacks, he has, some incredibly hardworking, tenacious lawyers who've been on his case for many, many years, and who, are by any objective measure doing an admirable job, a truly admirable job of trying to hold the United States government to account for what it did. He has brain damage as a result of being used as a training prop in the black sites, where this technique called walling, where they would violently throw prisoners against a wall. He was a training prop. They used him for people to try it out over and over and over again, resulting, in him getting brain damage, or certainly that was one of the elements that involved him getting brain damage. And Amar also has, suspected serious medical conditions at the moment. But again, because of the problems that I just spoke about, they cannot properly get diagnosed and analyzed in Guantanamo. And, he is a man who is, I think, still just in his late 40s. But, the last time that I met Jay Connell, one of his lawyers, and spoke to about him, he said, you would not know he's that age. He looks like an old man. This is how much the torture and abuse that's been inflicted on these people has aged them. It's really quite shocking, I think. And Amar genuinely, from all the reports and what I can tell, is someone whose reality is kind of blinking out bit by bit because of this brain damage that he was subjected to, which clearly is the responsibility of the CIA, who abused him so horribly.
And I know you wrote about this because it was from Niels Meltzer, who was a UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, that was actually pointing out that Baluchi had this thing where, he was still being subjected to noise and vibrations that were exacerbating or making these disorders even, or actually maybe adding more to his dysfunction. So is it that in these prison camps, they would put these men in their cells, and then they just set up these like white noise machines that they blast at you while you're sitting there?
What, in the black sites? Is this what are you talking about in the black
Well,
sites?
so if he's still being subjected to noise in Guantanamo, what like would what do they have sleep deprivation in the camps?
Well, I think the simple answer to that is that we don't know that much about exactly what has happened to these men in the, what are we on now, in the 18 years that they've spent at Guantanamo, in a facility that was, essentially sealed off entirely from the public, clearly in some way run by the CIA, as you're discussing, that Jay Connell is trying to pursue this case to establish that. And that, one of the things that Ramzi bin al-Shibh spoke about was noise, was his feeling of being persecuted by sound. And one of the things Majid Khan spoke about was ways in which abuse that I think rose to the level of torture was practiced still while he was at Guantanamo. We know from the early days of Guantanamo that the use of torture was rife. So I would be, it would be unwise to assume that certain things aren't being inflicted on the prisoners still, in an attempt to, disorientate them and damage them. I mean, why would we think, through all of these different administrations we've had, with the conclusions that the UN rapporteur reached about Guantanamo just last year, that anything has fundamentally changed, to detract from the way this is, the entire facility is devoted to the lawlessness and the torture and abuse of the men who are held there at quite a fundamental level.
All right, so just to hold myself accountable, because I made a mistake. The other two defendants with the plea deals are Walid bin Atash and then Mustafa al-Hassawi.
Yeah.
And I actually wrote a little bit about this, and I have to go correct it because I somehow misread what was happening with Bellucci. But anyways, let's get to, before we end, let's get to Joe Biden, because part of what covering Guantanamo entails is constantly assessing the scale of the failures of people who are in power, especially when they allegedly don't share the philosophy that Guantanamo Bay should be open. So, we could sit here and probably debate whether that's in fact true, because we're not seeing actions that back it up. But okay, President Barack Obama said that Guantanamo should be closed. And based on that promise, we can say he failed because it was not actually closed. And we can assess how and where he failed. Joe Biden was his vice president. He comes into office in 2021 after his inauguration, has all the opportunities in the world to take an opposite approach from Donald Trump, who obviously is a full-throated supporter of keeping these men in indefinite detention, and probably would even like it if he could get daily videos of them being waterboarded sent to him in the Oval Office. But Joe Biden, what is his legacy when it comes to Guantanamo?
Well, he has, just 2 months now to salvage something of a legacy when it comes to Guantanamo. Essentially, what happened when he took office is that after the horrible 4 years of Trump, when he had really fundamentally sealed Guantanamo shut, lawyers and NGOs and people who had inroads into the Biden administration started talking, having meetings with officials to put across the important message that the very least that needed to be done was that the United States government needed to stop holding people indefinitely without charge or trial. There were dozens of men from the 40 that Biden inherited from Trump who were held in this endless limbo. They were subject to review processes, a parole type process called the periodic review boards established under Obama. But those review boards constantly kept finding that these men had to be detained indefinitely because they still constituted a threat to the United States security. In his first year in office as well, 75 members of the House of Representatives and 24 senators, all Democrats, obviously, wrote to him as well to point this out, and he responded. There was that sliver of recognition that you get in democratic administrations in the United States that Guantanamo is fundamentally not something that you should be shouting about as anything good. That fundamental sliver of recognition that everything about it is horrendously wrong came into play. So nearly all of the men who were endlessly being approved for indefinite imprisonment without charge or trial were approved for release by the periodic review boards. I think it was something like 22 men that he inherited who were forever prisoners, and there are now just 3. There are just 3 men out of the 30 still held who have never been charged with a crime. Unfortunately, and also what Biden did in his first couple of years in office was that he released 10 men from Guantanamo. That's significant in the sense that history shows us that the longer time goes on, getting people out of Guantanamo is harder than getting blood out of a stone. But it all came to a halt. The last person to be freed was in April last year. And no one has been released for over a year and a half. And he's holding these 16 men who have long been approved for release, and he has not freed them, and he has shown no sign that he is going to free them. Now, these are men who were mostly approved for release by him. But now those decisions took place between 2 and 4 years ago. The decisions to release these men. And they are purely administrative decisions, which means that there's no legal mechanism involved in them that can compel the government to actually release them if it feels like it can't be bothered or if it's a bit difficult. Now, the tragic aspect of this story, I think, is that Biden finally appointed someone to the State Department, a former ambassador called Tina Kadenow, to deal specifically with resettlements from Guantanamo. And she was on the phone to everybody she could find all around the world going like, will you help us out? And pretty much everybody said, no, we're not interested. Some countries said, yeah, we helped out Obama when he came begging back in 2008 and in the years that followed, but we're not interested now. Perhaps you haven't noticed, but the world has moved much further to the right in the 15 years since. Taking in former Guantanamo prisoners is politically not of interest to us and probably dangerous and damaging. So no, thank you. The only country she could persuade to take an interest was Oman, which is next to Yemen. And most of the men who are approved for release and are from Yemen. I should say, I don't think we mentioned it. They cannot be sent back to their home countries because Republicans yet again inserted provisions into the annual NDAA preventing the return of prisoners to certain proscribed countries, of which Yemen is the most significant. So that deal was going to go ahead. Fantastic work, honestly, on the part of Tina Kadenow to negotiate this. Then October the 7th happened. And by some accounts, the plane was actually on the runway at Guantanamo when the Biden administration decided that the political optics of freeing these men were inappropriate, and the flight was cancelled, and no date has been set for these men to be released again. And unfortunately, just a month ago, Tina Kadenow died, and she didn't even get to see the results of what she had tried to do in the last position that she had in the United States government. And the complication is that since all of this, since the freeze on the releases to Oman, Oman itself has, because Oman took in several dozen, mostly Yemeni prisoners between 2015 and 2017 as a favor to President Obama. And it was one of the most successful resettlement programs as far as we understood, where people were helped in getting work, people got married, they were building lives there. And then Oman decided that it was going to send them all involuntarily back to Yemen, which, it shouldn't do, not just because US law prohibits sending Guantanamo prisoners back to Yemen, but also because it contravenes the non-refoulement part of human rights, where you are legally obliged not to send people back to places where they may face the risk of torture or other ill treatment. But they did it anyway. What I'm struggling to comprehend now, Kevin, is whether it's possible to revive Oman as a safe destination for these men. It certainly seems to be the only one on the cards. The huge problem, I think, and obviously nobody noticed this when they sent the men back to Oman, back to Yemen from Oman, is that a State Department spokesperson actually said, we had no expectation with any of these resettlement programs that they would be for life. In other words, he was justifying that when men are sent from Guantanamo to a third country because they can't be sent back to their home countries, he was saying, essentially, we kind of thought there was a 2-year limit on that. He didn't explain what on earth was supposed to happen to these men who had nowhere else to go to if at the end of 2 years, the resettlement turned out to be temporary rather than permanent. And that's an open-ended question that's just hovering in the ether now. No mainstream journalist is interested in it. What does it actually mean? I mean, and the implication for it is that, the dozens and dozens and dozens of men who have been resettled in third countries, all of these took place under Obama, but many, many dozens of people in many countries. It fundamentally suggests that none of them are actually safe. But, just to return to the point of these 16 men, it is an absolute disgrace that because of the lack of a legal mechanism involved in approving these men for release, they can't go to a court, they can't ask a judge to compel the United States government to release them. The Biden administration would certainly act if it was legally obliged to do so, but it isn't. Is he going to actually do something in the limited time that he has left to free these men, or is he going to condemn them to another 4 years of hell under Donald Trump, when the prison will be sealed shut? I think it's a huge scandal in waiting. If he doesn't do something to resolve his legacy, I think he will be damned for this amongst many other failures. But in the footnote of history about Guantanamo, if he doesn't resolve something before January, then he will get a black mark for dealing with the huge, never-ending stain that Guantanamo represents in modern U.S. history.
Issue of resettlement. I remember following some of the stories of men who were resettled and the kind of poverty and despair that they have experienced in these third countries because they are, not able to return home. And it was my understanding that I guess what's baffling for you to say that I hadn't heard that the State Department had taken this position that maybe they would just drift back to their homes or end up back there anyways because the countries would send them. I always thought that they were supposed to be resettled to these third countries as part of the national security guarantee, that they would not rejoin fighting. I mean, what is part of the ban, and you didn't say it, but it is the supposed impetus for not releasing the Yemenis and people from other nations, is that, well, if they go back there, then there's a fear that they would return to the battlefield because there are conflicts or because there are fights in which they could engage against the United States military in the Middle East. And so I always thought that this resettlement was permanent. And then the approach was also permanent too, in the sense that, I remember with this with Saudi Arabia, it was we would give them some of the men, and then they were put through like re-education in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's astonishing that this State Department spokesperson came up with this suggestion that resettlement was never meant to be permanent. When, as you point out, certainly in the I mean, in some cases, the United States has recognized that it's not safe to send people back to their home countries because of the threat that is posed to them by their governments. And but in the case of Yemen, it was strictly a national security issue. It was meant to be unsafe from a national security point of view for these Yemenis from Guantanamo to end up going back to Yemen. So what the State Department under Biden seems to have, stealthily established is that the ban only exists if it doesn't involve the intermediary of a third country, which is I don't think Republicans are going to care very much about this, Kevin, because they're about to get a president who isn't going to let anybody go anyway. But if they were paying attention, they would be deeply shocked that this kind of subterfuge had happened. And again, I suppose what we have to look at is, the notion the United States has of itself is that, it's the all-powerful entity in the world, and everybody does what it says. Clearly there are actually power struggles involved between the United States and other countries. And in this case, they certainly don't seem to have wanted to make demands on Oman to reverse what it was planning to do. And I'm sure there's a bigger geopolitical argument to that. I mean, one of the other things is that some settlements have gone very badly. So the Obama administration sent several dozen men to the United Arab Emirates, where they were imprisoned and abused probably even more horribly than they'd been at Guantanamo, even though they were promised that they would be given new lives. And the United States government, even when Biden got in, under Trump, why would Trump care? When Biden got in, failed to do anything to prevail on the United Arab Emirates. And I suspect that's because in the power game between the United States and the United Arab Emirates, the United Arab Emirates is actually the boss. But, that was a dreadful story. And the UAE also sent all these Yemenis back to Yemen against the rules. And also just recently sent the sole Russian who had been sent there because it was unsafe for him to go back to Russia. They sent him home as well, where we're all hoping that he will be okay. But, that was a case where the United States had sent a Russian to the UAE to protect him from the abuses that he would face in Russia. And then the UAE sent him back to Russia anyway. So, that's pretty despicable, isn't it?
It is despicable. Yeah. All right. Well, we need to wind this up, but I don't want to let you go without mentioning to people who are tuned in that you have a band and you're part of a group called the Forefathers, and you have an album out now called Songs of Love and Resistance that people should go listen to. And I did want to give you a few minutes on this just because I find myself drifting back to a project that I had been doing regularly, hoping to restart it. I let it go because my media organization closed, and so I was just doing stuff independently. But with the second election of Donald Trump, I'm very concerned about having a space broadly in the arts for being able to discuss the world around us, to grapple with our emotions, and also to resist. And that's what your music, broadly speaking, does. And you've even brought Guantanamo into it. So
Yeah.
I invite you to say a few words about your band and why it's important to you to make this music along with your journalism.
Well, thanks, Kevin. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, the the band has been going for 10 years. I set it up with friends. Um, we just wanted to see what would happen. But when we started doing it, I suddenly got back into what I'd done when I was younger, which is I just found that I started writing songs. And of course, you know, given the work that I do, the songs were very political. And you know, and it's a helpful outlet for me, I think, because music and the kind of poetry that is involved in song lyrics, I suppose, are a different form of outlet for what our concerns are than, you know, what we spend so much of the time doing, which is certainly in my case is writing a lot, but also, you know, when we get the opportunity, engaging in these kind of fruitful conversations, but a different part of the brain, I suppose. You know, and I really enjoy having the opportunity to try and put things across in that way. Although I'm as bewildered as I was 10 years ago when you know, first very kindly focused on what I was doing when the band started, and we did a song for Shaka Armour, the last British prisoner. How much of a depoliticized world so much of music is. You know, we know obviously that there are aspects of Western culture that involve significant protest music, quite often in a kind of underground sense. And you know, from the project you did on protest music for years, what a vast amount of extraordinary protest music there is in the global South, where people are confronted in their everyday lives with injustice and persecution. But there's a strange depoliticized amnesia that is part of the West in so many ways, which is, you know, and I think has been deliberately fostered over many decades to disconnect people's pleasure, their interests from politics. You know, and I think that that's been very dangerous, and I just find it a bit sad, really, that people are so depoliticized. So if there are politicized people listening to this who would like to check out the band, then I hope you'll provide a link for them to the Forefathers on Bandcamp. And our
Yes.
latest album is Songs of Loss and Resistance. You called it
Oh,
Songs of Love and Resistance, Kevin, which
well,
is probably
whatever.
a better title, but we've used love in a title before, and there's a lot of loss involved in the topics of these songs, which actually cover about the last 8 years of politics in the UK and around the world.
My mistake. My second mistake, but a little more innocent. Look, we don't have a long time for this, but let's come back to this later, because I think one of the struggles, as we've seen the rise of right wing energy, these movements, or they're not really movements, but this, you know, it's an anti-establishment right wing populism, so to speak.
Yeah,
It's from the anger at elites, and it's directed in a destructive manner. And you know,
absolutely.
the two things I would leave you with, and you're welcome to have the final word, is that one, to me, the answer to this is creating that because this is so destructive, it is immensely powerful for us. You know, even me just sitting down here to talk with you and put together this interview makes me feel better as a person, because it goes up against the kind of destructive forces that are out there, just, you know, telling everybody it's despair, it's misery, that's all you get. Well, I'm giving people something to engage in. I think that's probably what you feel like when you make your music. I also think that's probably what you feel like when you write something, because it helps people understand something that is an important issue. But the other thing that I'd say is, as part of resistance, it's important to have these spaces. It's important to create these spaces, and I don't actually believe across the arts, music, film, theater, paintings, whatever it might be that makes you feel passionate, that we should let them just be corporatized by these elites that are using them for their enrichment, but also to project their power. And if we do disengage, it's a mistake to not say that, like, we want to be part of this as well, because it is a part of forming, I think, an important human connection beyond our activism, which is important. I mean, it helped us free Julian Assange. So
Yeah.
it's a kind of activism that we have to have. But I also think that human connection around arts is really crucial when you see somebody like Trump or I mean, I would say to you across the pond, Keir Starmer, who is not an opponent of this rise of right wing fascism, but how do you build resistance to that? Because it's a little less difficult. It's a little more difficult when he isn't just going around, being so brazen like Donald Trump.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the points you're making, Kevin, and I'm sure that when we get into Trump's second presidency, it's going to become apparent that those of us who disagree, and in many cases, those of us who will be facing certain types of persecution, come together. We need big movements of people to look out for each other's backs. But on creativity, I absolutely agree with you. And there's another point that you just didn't mention, but that is another reason why we must insist on human creativity, and that is to prevent our lives from being taken over by AI. And human beings, bless us, we have abilities to do things that no AI programs, however much money is spent on them, are going to be able to replicate. Our uniqueness, our specialness must be celebrated. It can lead us, as we know, more than ever, I think, at the moment, into the darkest, most deranged and depraved places through the people who assume positions of power and influence, unfortunately. But for the majority of people, that's simply not the case. And we are certainly much more extraordinary than the machines that are trying to replace us.
Well, I really appreciate you throwing that in there because the detestable figure of Elon Musk might have some kind of a made up cabinet position for bringing more robots into our lives. I see that the security detail for Trump at Mar-a-Lago has a robot dog now.
Yeah.
So that already tells you that we should be fearful. But anyways, everybody is.
Maybe someone can hack the robot dog, though, Kevin.
Exactly. All right, everyone. So thank you, Andy. And again, your work, I'll share a link for it. It is at andyworthington.co.uk, I believe. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Yep. And then we'll put a link up for the Bandcamp. Thanks
Thank
for
you so
talking,
much.
Andy.
It's been a real pleasure talking to you, Kevin. Thanks so much.